Good morning, folks. Pleasure to be here. I learned about this whole idea of these prosperity zones a number of months ago when I met with Nick Duranius, who's become a good friend, and I find this to be one of the most intriguing and interesting and promising ideas to promote economic growth and higher living standards. One of the great new ideas that I've heard, and I'm not an expert on how this would work. You're going to hear from others about how you would implement this, but it is a really interesting idea, and I'm so glad that so many of you came out to hear about this. It's almost sad that we need to have prosperity zones in America because we're supposed to be one big prosperity zone, but we've moved so far away from the basic ideas that create economic growth. I fully subscribe to this idea that if we could have some of these zones in place that become examples of what can happen if you have full-flung free market capitalism, that it will spread like a virus. So we were talking last night, and it's like that scene from when Harry Met Sally. I'll have what she's having. Remember that one? Well, this is the way it's going to work here in the United States. If we get this in place, I think it will spread like a virus. So my task this morning, just for a few minutes, is to talk about what's gone wrong with the economy, why we need these things. And I am extremely concerned about the direction of our U.S. economy. We have seen the worst. This is kind of the heart of the problem. We've seen, I don't know how many of you have had to sit through the freak show that's going on in Philadelphia, but we've had, they keep talking about how wonderful the economy is going and all the wonderful things that's happened under Obamonomics, and it's nonsense, and most Americans know it's not. We've had the weakest recovery from a recession since the Great Depression, and it is a shame how far we have fallen as a nation. And if you look at this chart, what you're looking at is the recoveries over time and the pace of recovery. And you can see that under Obama, we've just had a recovery that's been about barely half the normal size recovery. So we've grown at 15% under Obama over the last 7 years. Normally, at this stage of recovery, we'd have grown by 29%. And if we'd had a Reagan-style expansion, and that's the one we really should be paying attention to, because Reagan put in place the very kind of prosperity ideas that we're talking about here: lower taxes, lower regulation, sound money, respect of personal property rights, and things like that. When we put in place those policies, the economy grew 2.5 times faster than it has under Obama. So we've had basically 2% growth in this recovery. In the normal recovery, we have about 3.5% growth, and under Reagan, we had 4% growth, and that's what we should aspire to. We should aspire to these much more rapid rates of economic growth. And as you can see here, these numbers may not seem all that meaningful, but what this is telling you is that if over the last 7 years we had done the right set of policies, then exactly the wrong set of policies, Obamacare, the $800 billion waste of money we did on the stimulus plan, the minimum wage increases, the $4 trillion of money that the Fed has put into the economy, none of that worked. The liberals threw their entire playbook at this recession. And you can see what I'm saying here is we would have $3 trillion more GDP today if we had done the right set of policies rather than the wrong set of policies. And that's what we have to hold liberals, Obama and Hillary, accountable for. And $3 trillion, by the way, is a gigantic number. That is to say, $3 trillion is larger than the entire annual GDP of Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Indiana put together. So that's what we've lost in terms of output because of this feeble recovery. And you can see here that we're probably about 5.5 million jobs behind where we should be. So if we had a Reagan-style expansion, we'd have 5.5 million more jobs. This is really important. This growth gap is why Americans are so angry. And I should say this doesn't just apply to the Obama years, it also applies to the Bush years. So if you go back to the year 2000, 2001, this has been 16 years now that the average American worker, the middle-class workers, the working-class folks, as Hillary Clinton calls them, it's been 15 years since the average American has had a pay raise. that keeps pace with inflation. And I would submit to you that's why there's so much anger and resentment out there. And when Obama's out there giving a speech talking about how they rescued the economy, most Americans don't believe it because they don't feel it. There was a Fox poll that just came out a couple of weeks ago that showed 45% of Americans think the U.S. economy is still in a recession. Wow, I mean, this is supposed to be the 7th year of recovery, and 45% of Americans think we're still in a recession? How is that possible? And the answer to that is pretty obvious. If your income isn't growing, and in fact, if your income has fallen, you are in a recession, right? It doesn't matter how your neighbor is doing. And what we've seen, actually, one of the most interesting things about the adverse policies we've put in place in the last 8 years is I would submit to you that almost every policy that Obama has put in place for the last 8 years has had one common theme, and that is income redistribution, right? They've all been oriented towards redistributing from rich to poor. And yet the irony of the left-wing policies that have been put in place in this country is that, in fact, the people who have gained the most are the people in the top 10%. So the top 10% have had actually big gains in income. The bottom 90% have had none. One of the lessons of that, by the way, is that when you put redistribution ahead of growth, you get neither more fairness nor growth. And so we've had very little growth, and we've had the gains of the economy go to the people at the very top. Free market capitalism actually is a way to redistribute income in the most fair and equitable way. We have not had an expansion. I think that's the reason you're seeing such a revolt among voters. I wanted to just make one last point about how it is that and those of you who have been ALEC members and attended these meetings over the years have heard me talk about this, but this is for some of you who are new to ALEC. This is really important. We do a ranking of the states every year through Rich States, Poor States, and we've been doing this for 8 years. And I'm showing you this because it shows what could possibly happen if we were to adopt the right set of policies that are in states like Texas, if we were to adopt those for the country, what it would mean for an expansion. And so what I'm doing here is showing you the kind of extreme example of 4 largest states in the United States: Florida, Texas, California, and New York. 2 of those states are red states. Florida and Texas, obviously, are, you all know they have no income tax in Florida and Texas. California and New York have the highest income tax rates of about 13.5%. Florida and Texas are right-to-work states. California and New York are not right-to-work states. California and New York do not allow drilling. Texas and Florida are all in on drilling, and so on. And you just go on down the line with respect to regulations and taxes. Florida and Texas are free market states, and California and New York are the opposite. And then you ask the question, well, does it matter? Do these policies lead to a differential in growth? And the answer is absolutely yes. What you're seeing here is an amazing thing that over the last 10 years, Florida and Texas have gained well more than 1 million people, and California and New York have lost almost 1.5 million people. People are leaving California and New York, and they're leaving those areas because they're not prosperity zones, right? They're the opposite of prosperity zones, and they're going to Florida and Texas because that's where the policies are right. That tells us a lot about the potential if we were to, I always say it in my speeches when I'm talking about the states, I say, the goal of the United States right now to regain prosperity is to make America look a lot more like Texas and a lot less like New York, right? And if you do that, we're going to get a lot more jobs and a lot more growth. The prosperity zones idea is so powerful because what we're talking about is creating centers within the United States where you would put in place all of the kind of free market ideas that we know cause growth. And when you do that, you're going to see investment capital, people, businesses moving into those areas. Property values will rise. It's a very exciting idea. I'm old enough to remember when Jack Kemp was around, and Jack Kemp sold the whole idea about enterprise zones. And that was his idea that we never really fully got off the ground for one reason or another. But to the extent we did have some enterprise zones, they really did work. And you did find people moving across the lines into the areas where freedom existed. I think this is an idea, especially, one last point, for those of you who listened to Rick Perry yesterday. How many of you heard Rick Perry's lunch talk, which was spectacular? And one of the points that he made that I think is so important is that we as conservatives have not been sufficiently attentive to the abysmal conditions that exist in inner cities. whether it's the schools or the crime or the lack of jobs and the lack of economic development, liberalism has killed our inner cities. And it's time for we as conservatives to stop being inattentive to that and to really look at how we can go into inner cities and put our ideas at work. And what I love about the idea that Nick has come up with is, I would hope, Nick, that the areas where we would see this germinate would be, let's start in the worst areas of the country first, where you couldn't possibly, there's no tax revenue there or there's no tax base, there's no industry. If you could actually start bringing industry in, you're going to create more tax revenues and more jobs. You're going to lift people out of poverty by improving the schools, by improving the business environment, and that will, to borrow an old phrase, I think that's a great way to make America great again. So thank you very much.